untitled vectors, where we're going to look at the dot product again and to find out how to determine the angle between two vectors. So the formula that you're going to use is right here. It's cosine of theta, where theta is an angle measure. So you're given an angle measure between these two vectors. And then you're going to take the dot product and divide it by the magnitude of each of the vectors separately. Okay, so if you're asked to actually find that angle theta, you're going to use this second formula, which is just this written in inverse. So you would do the inverse cosine of the dot product divided by the magnitude of each. Okay, so I'm going to show you two problems using this, and you're going to need your calculator for that. And then I'm going to show you one problem using this, where they want us to find the dot product. Okay? All right. So the first one, for problem number 1, and let me zoom in a little bit more, is they want us to find the angle between vector u and vector v. Okay, so they give us two vectors. They give us u is at 5, -2, and vector v ends at -2, +3. And so we're going to use that second formula. We're going to plug it in. We get down there about here, and then we use the calculator to spit out the answer for us. Okay? So to get the dot product, we want to take the first value of vector u times the first value of vector v. Then we're going to take the second value of vector u times the second value of vector v. Multiply those, right? Positive 5 times -2 is -10. -2 times 3 is -6. Then we add those two together to get -16. That -16 is what's going to plug in down here when we go to calculate it with our calculator. Okay? Now let's get the magnitude of each of those vectors. Okay? So the magnitude for u, we only use the numbers from vector u. We take the first number and square it, so 5 squared. Take the second number and square it, so -2 squared. Make sure you're being careful with your parentheses. Okay, notice that I put 5 in parentheses and -2 in parentheses. If you square something that's positive, it's obviously positive, but if you square something that's negative, it's also positive. Yeah. So make sure you put those parentheses so you remember that you're squaring -2, not squaring 2 and then taking the opposite of it. Okay, it's two different things. Okay, so these are both positive because you're not going to end up with any imaginary numbers here. They're all going to be positive. Okay, 5 squared is 25, -2 squared is 4, 25 plus 4 is 29. You don't need to change it to a decimal. But if you did, it would be like 5 point something-ish, right? It's kind of between 25 and 36. But just leave it as a radical, okay? Because we're just going to plug it in down here as a radical and put it in the calculator as a radical. And let the calculator do the work for us, okay? Now let's get the magnitude of vector v. So we're going to take the first value and square it, take the second value and square it, and then add those two numbers together. So -2 squared is 4, 3 squared is 9, and 4 plus 9 is 13. So we've got the square root of 13. Again, we're just going to plug it into the calculator that way. Where did my calculator go? Oh, there it is. Right there. Okay. All right. So when you need to practice entering this into the calculator. Why? Because it's a little bit tricky, because your calculator wants parentheses on certain parts. And if you're just using a regular scientific calculator, like I'm going to use, the screen isn't big enough to show you all of the problem. But if you have a graphing calculator, the screen is big enough and will show you everything that you've typed in, which is nice because then you can see that you typed it in correctly versus not typing it in correctly, and then it gives you a syntax error and you don't know where it's at. Okay? graphing calculator, you'll be able to see where all the parentheses are at and see that you did it correctly. Okay? So to type this in the calculator, I'm going to type all this in first and hit enter. So it's going to give me this decimal. Then I'm going to do the inverse cosine and use my second answer button. You guys know how to use the second answer? To plug whatever decimal that chunks out. Okay? So here's what it looks like. So I'm simply going to type in what's in parentheses here. So the negative 16 divided, and then I'm going to use the parentheses to type in this whole denominator of the square root of, is that 29? Yeah, 29. And notice what's under that radical is within parentheses, times the square root of 13, and whatever's under that radical is in parentheses. Then I need to end the parentheses of the denominator. So it ends up looking like I have an extra set of parentheses, but I don't. And hit enter. So it gives you this big, long decimal. You don't even need to write that down. Just leave it sitting in the calculator, because in a second, then when I do my second answer, it'll put it in for me. So now I need to do the inverse cosine, and then second answer, hit equals, and it spits out the 145 point blah, 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 blah. Okay? So just round it to like the nearest tenths or hundredths, whatever you're comfortable with. I usually just do tenths, but if the directions tell you specifically, do what the directions tell you. If it doesn't, tenths or hundredths is usually good. Unless you're in science. I think your science teacher would probably tell you, say what, 3 places? Yeah, usually 3. So, I mean, if you're used to science, then go to 3, because that would be pretty normal. Okay? Okay. So if you don't have your own calculator, then after the lesson, borrow someone's calculator and make sure you know how to type this in and get the same answer so that you're typing it in correctly, because that's the trickiest part, is typing it in the calculator. Okay? So make sure you know how to do that part, because on the test, I can't help you do that. You need to be able to do it. Okay? Any questions on 1? Okay. On 2 is where you need your unit circle. And that's where we're going to get some numbers from. Okay? So if it has the cosine of pi over 3, find pi over 3 on your unit circle, and the cosine is what? What did you say? 1/2, which is I wrote as 0.5. Okay, so if you need to change it to a decimal, change it to a decimal. And then I got 0.66 for, well, first of all, this is in, what they call it, linear combination form. So you have to put it or use it as vector, okay? And then plug all the numbers in from your unit circle, so it's like you're doing 2 things at once, okay? So get the dot product, gets you down to 0.866 for each of those. Then you have to get, excuse me, then you have to get the magnitude of each. So you're basically, you take the same numbers you used up there, you're just going to do U together, so this one and this one just happens to be the same as that one. And then that one and that one together and square them. And each of them come really close to 1. Well, the square root of 1 is just 1, okay? So when we go to plug it in the calculator, this one's actually easier than problem number 1 was, because you really only need to find the inverse cosine of 0.866. So let me do that. Inverse cosine of 0.866. And I got like 30 degrees. Okay? So on that one, the trickiest part is using your unit circle, and that's about it. It doesn't have, compared to this one, it's a lot less complicated typing it in the calculator than the first one was. Okay? If you would like to borrow, if someone in your group doesn't have, at least one of you have a scientific calculator, I can hand you a scientific calculator. Okay? All right, and then the last one, they actually give you the angle measure for theta. So instead of asking you to find that angle measure, they give you the angle measure. They give you the magnitude of both u and v, and they just want you to find the u dot v. So we're actually going to use the first formula on this one, kind of like when you are doing trigonometry on a right triangle, and you use regular trig to get side measures, but you use inverse trig to get angle measures. So it works the same way with vectors, okay? So the first step, I would say write down that formula. Second step, plug in all the information you know. So you know the angle measure, plug it in. You know the magnitude of u, which is 8. You know the magnitude of v, which is 2. And then you just simplify and do inverse operations until you get u dot v by itself. Okay? So if 8 times 2 is 16, you have a 16 in that denominator. So multiply both sides by 16. Half of 16 is just 8. That means u dot v, or the dot product, is 8. Okay? So there's basically